The morning air over Yorkshire was thick with fog, wrapping the hills and the old Thompson farm in a cold, gray hush. Ellie Thompson sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the creaks and sighs of the house as it woke. She'd lived alone here for more than 20 years, ever since her husband passed, and she left her service as a British Army medic behind. Now, at 59, every morning felt the same. But today, a new current of uncertainty crackled through the air. She shuffled across the wooden floor, her joints aching from a life of work and loss, and pulled back the faded curtains. The fields were empty except for a few stubborn sheep wandering near the broken fence. Beyond them, the woods pressed close, dark and silent. The farm, once full of voices and laughter, had grown quiet, the walls lined with photos that nobody looked at anymore. A worn saddle hung on the wall above the fireplace, her father's, then hers, unused for years. In the kitchen, she brewed tea and set out 2 mugs instead of 1. She hesitated, almost putting the second back, but left it there. The letter from her solicitor sat on the table, half hidden under a stack of bills. Sophie was coming today. 15 years old, newly orphaned, full of questions and silence. Ellie didn't know how to be a mother, let alone a grandmother. She poured the tea, hands trembling slightly, and tried to imagine what she would say. Sophie's train would arrive in less than an hour. As Ellie waited, she thought about the farm's decline. The barn roof leaked, the pasture gate was always coming off its hinges, and the winter feed was running low. Most nights she ate soup out of a can, staring out into the dark, remembering the faces she'd lost. Still, she kept the place going, stubborn as the Yorkshire stone it was built from. A car pulled up the gravel drive, crunching stones under tired wheels. Ellie straightened, wiped her hands on her jeans, and stepped out onto the porch. The door of the taxi opened slowly, and Sophie emerged, dragging a battered suitcase behind her. She looked smaller than Ellie remembered, thinner, pale, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. Her eyes were guarded, scanning everything as if expecting something to jump out of the fog. "Hi," Ellie said quietly, her voice rougher than she wanted. Sophie stared at her for a moment, then nodded, not quite meeting her gaze. "Hi." The driver hauled the suitcase to the porch, nodded at Ellie, and drove away, leaving them alone with the crows and the wind. Ellie picked up the suitcase and led Sophie inside. The house felt even smaller now, every scuff on the walls and crack in the floor more obvious. Sophie stood in the hallway, not moving, her arms wrapped around herself. Ellie showed her to a tiny bedroom, the same one her daughter had slept in decades before. "If you need anything, just ask," Ellie said. She left the door open, listening for footsteps or voices, but Sophie was silent. After a while, she heard the soft thud of the suitcase hitting the floor. That afternoon, Ellie tried to keep busy. She mended a broken fence post, checked the hayloft, swept out the empty barn. Sophie watched her from the kitchen window, never coming outside, her face unreadable. Ellie found herself glancing back, wishing for a sign, a word, a smile, anything. As evening fell, they ate dinner in awkward silence. Ellie made stew, but Sophie picked at her food, her gaze fixed on the wood stove. At one point, Ellie tried to ask about school, but Sophie shrugged, staring down at her bowl. "I'll try to make this work," Ellie thought. "I have to, for her." Later, after Sophie went to bed, Ellie wandered outside. The air was sharp, full of distant sounds. An owl, the wind in the trees, the hum of the road far away. She walked past the barn, past the old apple tree, and stood at the edge of the woods. Somewhere in there, she thought. Something was watching her. Maybe it was just a fox or a badger, but the hairs on her neck prickled. She turned to go back inside, but a faint rustle stopped her. For a moment she froze, listening. Then, shaking her head, she walked back to the house, telling herself it was nothing. That night, sleep wouldn't come. She lay awake, thinking about the years behind her and the strange, heavy silence of the farm. The wind rattled the windows. Somewhere in the darkness, an animal called out. A high, thin whinny that sent a shiver down her spine. Horses had always been part of this land, but she hadn't owned one since her father's old mare died years ago. She pulled the covers tighter, trying to banish the feeling of being watched. In the morning, Ellie woke to a chill. Sophie was already up, sitting in the kitchen with a notebook open, her pen scratching softly. Ellie made breakfast, trying not to intrude. "Do you want to help me with the animals?" Ellie asked, trying to sound casual. Sophie shrugged, closing her notebook. "I guess." Together they fed the sheep, checked the fence, and swept the barn. The work was slow, awkward. Ellie tried to teach Sophie how to tie a proper knot, but the girl's fingers fumbled, and she turned away, embarrassed. Ellie watched her, feeling the old ache of loss and longing. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had thickened, and the air grew heavy. Ellie went to check the far pasture. As she reached the edge of the woods, she stopped, frowning. Something was moving in the trees, something large and silent, just out of sight. She stepped forward, heart pounding. A shape emerged from the shadows. For a moment, she thought it was a stag, but then she saw the thin legs, the dark mane, the wild, rolling eyes. A horse. Small, battered ribs showing through its dull brown coat. It stared at her, trembling, ears pinned back in fear. Ellie took a step forward, hands out, her voice low and gentle. "Easy now. It's all right." The horse snorted, backing away, but didn't run. Ellie moved slowly, speaking softly, her heart aching at the sight. She recognized the breed, Exmoor, rare and tough, meant for these hills. But this one looked half dead, a shadow of its kind. She stood there for a long time, letting the horse get used to her presence. The animal watched her, wary but desperate. She reached out, not expecting contact, and was surprised when the horse edged closer, nostrils flaring. She could see scars on its flank, old wounds poorly healed. "Who did this to you?" Ellie whispered. She knew what she had to do. Turning, she hurried back to the farm, calling for Sophie. Together they gathered blankets, water, and an armful of hay. "Come on," Ellie said. "I need your help." For the first time, Sophie's eyes lit up with curiosity. She followed Ellie into the woods, her fear forgotten for a moment. As they approached, the horse watched them, but didn't bolt. Ellie laid out the hay, speaking softly, telling the animal everything would be okay. Sophie stood beside her, silent, but her hand crept into Ellie's. Together, in the cold shadow of the trees, a fragile hope was born. Ellie had never been the type to believe in fate, but that morning, as she and Sophie crouched in the cold woodland shadows, she wondered if something had brought this battered horse into their lives for a reason. Thunder, that's the name that echoed in her mind, unbidden, as she studied the animal's nervous, trembling body. He looked as though he'd survived a dozen winters alone, his coat matted, his legs caked with mud and old scars crisscrossing his hide. Still, something fierce and proud burned in his dark eyes, a stubborn glint that refused to die. Sophie moved quietly beside Ellie, her steps soft on the leaf-strewn ground. For the first time since arriving at the farm, the teenager's expression wasn't shuttered or wary. It was wide open, her blue eyes full of wonder and a tremulous hope she probably didn't even recognize. She watched Ellie closely, hungry for instruction, for any sign that things might turn out all right. "Is he wild?" Sophie whispered. Ellie shook her head. "No, but he's been out here too long. See how thin he is, and those marks. Someone's mistreated him." Thunder shifted his weight and stamped his hoof, snorting warily. His ribs showed in sharp relief, and a wound above his fetlock oozed fresh blood. Ellie moved in small, careful increments, speaking low and steady as she tossed out more hay. She didn't expect Thunder to trust her right away. Trust, in her experience, was earned slowly, painfully, over time. But when she extended her hand, palm up, Thunder didn't rear or run. He lowered his nose, nostrils flaring, and took a single tentative bite of hay from her palm. Sophie let out a breath she'd been holding. "He's beautiful," she whispered, voice trembling. Ellie almost smiled. "He will be. Just needs some care." The clouds shifted overhead, casting rippling shadows through the trees. For a long time, the three of them stood there, 2 humans and a half-starved horse, locked in a fragile, cautious truce. The silence of the woods felt different now, almost hopeful. Bringing Thunder home was another matter. He balked at the rope, dancing nervously, muscles bunching under his tattered coat. Ellie's patience was tested as she gently coaxed him, talking to him the way she'd once soothed wounded soldiers, calm, deliberate, full of soft reassurances. "Easy, boy. No one's going to hurt you now. Let's go home." It was Sophie who finally got through to him. With a shy, almost instinctive tenderness, she held out an apple from her coat pocket. Thunder eyed it, nostrils twitching, and then took a careful step forward. Another. Soon he was following, drawn by the scent and the girl's unspoken promise that this place was safe. The journey back to the farmyard was slow, interrupted by pauses as Thunder's legs threatened to give out. But eventually, they reached the barn. Ellie opened the creaking door, heart pounding, praying he wouldn't bolt at the unfamiliar smells and sounds. He hesitated on the threshold, then stepped inside, lowering his head to sniff the old straw. Sophie watched, her arms wrapped around herself. Will he be okay? Ellie put a reassuring hand on Sophie's shoulder. If he's survived this long on his own, he's a fighter. But it's going to take time. Inside the barn, the air was warmer and thick with the scent of hay, dust, and leather. Thunder staggered to the far corner and collapsed onto the straw, sides heaving. Ellie and Sophie set to work immediately. While Ellie fetched water and bandages, Sophie filled a bucket with fresh hay, glancing back over her shoulder to check on the horse every few seconds. Ellie cleaned Thunder's wounds as best she could. Some were old and crusted with dirt, others raw and fresh. She spoke to him softly, her hands steady even when her heart ached at the pain in his eyes. "I know it hurts," she murmured. "I know, but you're safe now." Thunder shivered, but he didn't fight her. By the time she finished, her knees and back ached, but she saw a change in his eyes, a tiny flicker of trust, or maybe just exhaustion. That night, Ellie sat with Sophie in the barn, watching Thunder sleep. The horse's breathing was ragged but steady, and now that he was finally safe, the tension in his body had eased. Sophie was quiet, knees drawn to her chest, lost in thought. "I used to have a pony," she said suddenly, her voice so soft Ellie almost missed it. "When I was little, we had to sell her when Mom got sick." Ellie felt a lump rise in her throat. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Sophie nodded, blinking away tears. "I missed her so much," she whispered. For a moment, the gulf between them narrowed. Ellie reached over and squeezed Sophie's hand. They sat together in silence, listening to Thunder's slow, uneven breaths. As the days passed, their routine changed. Every morning and evening, they checked on Thunder, cleaning his wounds, brushing his tangled mane, coaxing him to eat a little more. The horse grew stronger with each passing day. He began to whinny for his breakfast, stamping his hooves when he saw Ellie and Sophie approach. The bond between the three deepened, built on patience, kindness, and a stubborn refusal to give up. Neighbors noticed. Old Mrs. Mallory from down the lane stopped by with a sack of carrots and a tin of biscuits. "Heard you took in a stray," she said, peering into the barn. "Looks like you've got your work cut out for you." Ellie smiled, a little embarrassed. "We'll manage." Sophie beamed with pride, showing Mrs. Mallory how Thunder would take treats from her hand. But not everyone approved. One afternoon, as Ellie repaired the fence, she heard voices at the end of the lane. Two men in expensive coats stood by a gleaming SUV, watching the farm with thinly veiled disdain. She recognized them, Charlie and James Harrington, owners of the vast Harrington estate next door. They were known for their prized racehorses and their arrogance. "Heard you found yourself a real champion," Charlie called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Ellie bristled, but kept her tone polite. "He's a good horse, just needs a little care." James snorted. "Looks like he belongs on the glue truck, not in a barn." Charlie's eyes glinted with amusement. "Tell you what, Miss Thompson, why don't you bring him to the Badminton Horse Trials next month? See how your little rescue stacks up against real horses." James laughed, shaking his head. "You'll embarrass yourself." Ellie's jaw clenched, but she refused to rise to the bait. "We'll see." As the Harringtons drove away, Sophie looked up at Ellie, fear and determination warring in her eyes. "Are we really going to do it? Enter the competition?" Ellie looked back at the barn, at Thunder's hopeful face peeking through the stall bars, and then down at Sophie's anxious expression. "Yes," she said quietly. "We'll show them what Thunder can do." Sophie grinned for the first time since arriving at the farm, hope flickering in her eyes. Ellie smiled back, feeling a rare sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, the future felt wide open, brimming with possibility. Thunder had come into their lives by chance, or maybe by fate. Either way, Ellie knew they were in this together, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. The rain swept across the Yorkshire fields in sweeping gray sheets, beating the roof of Thompson Farm with relentless insistence. Ellie sat at the kitchen table with Sophie, both of them wrapped in old wool blankets, sipping tea. Outside, Thunder stood at the barn's entrance, his coat slick with rain, but his eyes alive with curiosity as he watched the world shift and glisten. For several days after the encounter with the Harringtons, Ellie tried to keep life at the farm steady. But she could feel the tension in the air, a sense of being watched, of expectations building just beyond the stone walls. Word traveled fast in a place like this. The news that Ellie had taken in a half-starved stray and planned to enter the Badminton Horse Trials spread from neighbor to neighbor, often accompanied by laughter and disbelief. Sophie was the first to sense the weight of those expectations. At school, she overheard the other kids whispering about her crazy grandmother and the ugly wild horse. Some laughed, others were openly cruel, and one or two were just curious. Sophie tried to ignore them, burying herself in her studies, but the words stung. One rainy afternoon, Sophie burst into the kitchen, cheeks flushed. "They're saying we're making fools of ourselves," she blurted out, dropping her backpack on the floor. "That Thunder will embarrass us, and that the Harringtons only invited us to laugh at us in public." Ellie looked up from the receipts she was sorting. For a long moment she said nothing, just watched Sophie pace across the room, twisting her hands. "I know what people are like," Ellie finally said. "And I know what it's like to be looked down on, to be laughed at. But sometimes you've got to do what's right, even if everyone says you're wrong." Sophie stopped, frustration boiling over. "But what if we lose? What if Thunder isn't good enough?" Ellie cut her off gently but firmly. "Sophie, listen, winning or losing isn't the point. What matters is that we try, that we give Thunder and ourselves a chance." Sophie hesitated, then nodded, blinking away tears. Ellie stood, put her arm around Sophie's shoulders and led her outside. The rain had eased, and a golden light was breaking through the clouds. "Come on, let's check on Thunder." In the barn, Thunder greeted them with a snort and a toss of his head. He was filling out now, his ribs no longer so sharp, his coat gaining a healthy shine. There was a spark in him, a joy, a pride that hadn't been there before. Ellie brushed his mane, humming softly, while Sophie filled the feed bucket. As they worked, the old barn filled with warmth, the kind that comes from shared purpose. Ellie glanced at the saddle hanging on the wall, a relic from her father's day. The leather cracked, but still strong. She ran her fingers over it, remembering her father's voice, his laugh, the way he taught her to ride. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open. Charlie Harrington stood in the doorway, flanked by his brother James. They wore rain-slicked jackets and smug expressions. Behind them, the estate's gleaming Range Rover idled, headlights cutting through the drizzle. "Thought we'd stop by and see the competition," Charlie drawled, his gaze sweeping over the barn's muddy floor and the patched-up stall where Thunder stood. "Is this the famous horse?" James snickered. "Looks more like a walking skeleton, if you ask me." Ellie straightened, her voice cool. "He's stronger than he looks, and a damn sight braver than most." Charlie smirked. "You know, badminton isn't for amateurs. The best riders in the country compete. Are you sure you want to make a spectacle of yourself?" Sophie bristled, her fists clenching. "Thunder is just as good as any of your fancy horses," she shot back. Charlie laughed, a sound without warmth. "We'll see. Just don't be surprised when you're outclassed in front of everyone." With that, the brothers turned and left, their laughter echoing as they strode back to the car. Ellie waited until the engine noise faded, then looked at Sophie. "We won't let them get to us," she said. "They want us to give up. We're not going to." Sophie nodded, determination returning to her face. That evening, as the last light faded, Ellie sat by the kitchen window, her thoughts drifting. The Harringtons had money, influence, and a stable full of prize winners. She had an old barn, a battered saddle, and a rescued horse with more heart than any animal she'd ever known. She remembered the army, the times when she'd been underestimated, ignored, or doubted because she was a woman, or because she cared too much. Every victory had come at a price. Every loss weighed heavily, but giving up had never been an option. As the rain tapped gently at the window, Ellie took out a battered notebook and started making plans. Training Thunder would take everything she had: patience, creativity, strength. They would need to work every day, rain or shine. and she'd have to find a way to afford the entry fee for badminton, plus repairs for the old Land Rover. The next day, she called in a few old favors. Mrs. Mallory offered to help with chores in exchange for riding lessons for her grandson. Jack Hargreaves, the local mechanic, agreed to look at the Land Rover for a discount. And when she explained their situation to Mr. Price, the feed supplier, he extended her credit. Each small act of kindness added up. For the first time in years, Ellie felt the village rally around her, the way it used to when she was young. But the Harringtons weren't finished. Flyers appeared around town, advertising the Badminton Horse Trials, with a line added at the bottom in bold letters, featuring the return of Ellie Thompson and her wild rescue, Thunder. Come see if they can compete with the best. Sophie found one taped to her school locker and brought it home, crumpled and tear-stained. Ellie smoothed it out and pinned it to the kitchen corkboard. "Let them watch," she said quietly. "We'll give them a show they'll never forget." As training began, Thunder revealed himself to be as clever as he was spirited. He learned quickly, responding to Ellie's gentle cues and Sophie's patient encouragement. There were setbacks. Thunder bucked the first time Ellie tried the old saddle, and once he panicked at a tractor's roar, nearly breaking free. But every failure taught them something new. The community's doubt was a constant background noise, but inside the farm's old stone walls, something beautiful was growing. Trust, resilience, and the stubborn belief that they belonged in that competition. One night, after a long day of training, Sophie found Ellie staring at a faded photograph of her father in uniform, standing beside a proud gray horse. "Did you ever think you'd be doing this again?" Sophie asked. Ellie smiled, weary but proud. "No, but I think maybe it was always supposed to happen this way." They stood together in silence, listening to the soft sounds of thunder shifting in his stall, the gentle breathing of a horse who had been given a second chance. For the first time since she'd returned to the farm, Ellie felt hope, real, steady hope, settle deep in her bones. Outside, a thin moon broke through the clouds, casting silver light over the fields. The journey ahead would be long, and the road would not be easy. But Ellie knew with absolute certainty that she and Sophie and Thunder were ready to face whatever came next. The first rays of spring sunlight crept through the curtains, filling the Thompson farm kitchen with a faint, golden glow. Ellie poured steaming tea into 2 mugs and set one across from Sophie, who sat hunched over the table, sleep still lingering in her eyes. Thunder's whinny drifted from the barn, full of impatient energy. He was growing stronger by the day, his coat glossy and eyes bright. But the looming challenge of the Badminton Horse Trials pressed on all their minds. Ellie pushed aside the pile of bills and scribbled notes that had accumulated. She set down a worn, leather-bound notebook, the same one she'd used to plan medical logistics in Afghanistan and later to organize the chaos of farm life. Now, it would chart Thunder's path to badminton. "We'll need a plan," Ellie said, sliding the notebook toward Sophie. "And we'll need to be better prepared than anyone else. Not because of them." She nodded toward the window, meaning the Harringtons. "But because Thunder deserves it." Sophie nodded, tracing her finger along the page. Her confidence was still fragile, but Ellie could see the glint of determination behind the worry in her granddaughter's eyes. "What if he's not ready? What if we aren't?" Sophie's voice was soft, uncertainty coloring every syllable. "We can't control the outcome," Ellie replied. "But we can control how hard we try and how much heart we put in. That's always been enough for me." They began with the basics. The first day, Ellie led Thunder in slow circles around the pasture, reacquainting him with the rhythm of a rider's weight, the subtle cues of leg and rein. Thunder had once known these things. His body remembered even if his spirit flinched from time to time. Whenever he stumbled or grew tense, Ellie murmured softly, patience flowing through every gentle touch. Sophie watched, learning everything she could. When it was her turn to mount Thunder, she hesitated, glancing at Ellie for reassurance. Thunder sensed her nerves and shifted uneasily. Ellie steadied them both. "You're not alone," she said quietly. "I'm right here." The days blurred together. Ellie repaired the old saddle, her father's legacy, using oil and care to soften the leather and mend the straps. She polished the silver nameplate, brushing away years of dust to reveal the Thompson family crest. 2 horses rearing in defiance, a fitting symbol for the fight ahead. Sophie cleaned the bridle, her hands steadying with each careful stroke. Each morning, they woke before sunrise, the farm echoing with the sounds of new life. Birds singing, sheep calling, Thunder's hoofbeats thudding against the soft earth. They trained through drizzle and wind, sometimes pushing themselves until muscles burned and hands blistered. Ellie ran Thunder through the same drills she remembered from her father. Walking, trotting, cantering, and finally, careful jumps over makeshift fences fashioned from old barrels and broomsticks. Thunder learned quickly. Sometimes he would shy away from a new obstacle, only to tackle it bravely the next time, ears pricked and tail high. Sophie kept a secret tally in her notebook, each success a tiny triumph, each setback a lesson in persistence. At night, they gathered in the kitchen to review progress, poring over diagrams of the badminton course Ellie had printed from the library computer. Sophie studied the jumps, the sharp turns, the water crossings. She drew little sketches in the margins, mapping out strategies. "Do you think he'll be ready for the water jump?" Sophie asked one evening. Ellie smiled, remembering Thunder's first nervous encounter with a puddle in the back field. "He will be," she said. "So will we." The community, once skeptical, began to rally behind them. Mrs. Mallory delivered extra hay and oats with a wink, claiming she'd simply over-ordered. Jack Hargreaves showed up with a toolkit and spent 2 afternoons tuning up the Land Rover, refusing to accept a penny. A few old friends sent supportive letters, remembering Ellie's courage in the army and her devotion to the land. But not everyone was supportive. Flyers from the Harringtons still peppered the village, and whispers at the grocer's or post office often reached Ellie's ears. She ignored them, focusing instead on the rhythm of training, the slow progress day by day. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Sophie collapsed in the grass beside Thunder, who was munching contentedly. "It's never going to be enough," Sophie sighed. "We're just 2 people and 1 horse, against the whole world, it feels like." Ellie sat down beside her, watching the sun slip below the hills. "I've been the underdog before," she said, her voice calm. "People said a woman didn't belong in the army, that I was wasting my time caring about things that wouldn't change. But I showed up every day. I did the work. That's all we can do." Sophie turned to look at her, something shifting in her eyes. "You really think we can do it, don't you?" Ellie nodded. "Not because we're stronger or faster or richer, but because we care. Thunder knows it, and that's what will set us apart." As spring deepened, training became more intense. Thunder grew lean and powerful, his coat shining like burnished bronze in the morning light. Sophie became more confident, handling him with gentle authority. Ellie felt the years melting away as she rode, old scars fading under the rush of adrenaline and hope. One afternoon, a sudden storm swept in while they were riding. Thunder balked as thunderclaps echoed across the fields, but Ellie steadied him, her voice cutting through the wind. "Easy, boy. You've survived worse than this." Sophie laughed, breathless and wild, as the rain drenched them. By the time they returned to the barn, soaked and shivering, the three of them were grinning, united by the shared challenge, the knowledge that nothing, not even the Yorkshire weather, could break their spirit. Inside, as they toweled off and set out steaming bowls of soup, Ellie realized something had changed. The fear of failure was still there, lurking at the edges, but it no longer controlled them. They were a team, Ellie, Sophie, and Thunder. Whatever happened at Badminton, they would face it together. Late that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Ellie stood in the barn with Thunder. She ran her hand along his strong neck, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "You're more than they ever guessed," she whispered. "More than I dared hope." Thunder nickered softly, his breath warm in the cool night air. In that quiet moment, with the stars shining overhead and the scent of earth and hay all around, Ellie allowed herself to believe in the impossible. Dawn crept over Yorkshire, painting the fields in pink and gold as Ellie tightened the last strap on Thunder's halter. The old Land Rover Defender waited at the edge of the yard, its trailer hooked up and already half-packed with hay, water, and everything they might need for the long journey ahead. The whole farm seemed to hold its breath. Sophie stood by the barn, checking her lists for the 100th time. She looked smaller than usual beneath the oversized jacket Ellie had found in a trunk, her nerves and excitement warring on her face. Thunder, sensing the mood, stamped impatiently, eager to see what came next. Ellie checked the back seat. Bandages, grain, carrots, the emergency phone charger, and a battered thermos full of hot tea. Everything was ready, or as ready as it would ever be. "You sure you packed your boots?" Ellie asked. "Twice," Sophie replied, managing a crooked grin. The air was sharp as they loaded Thunder into the trailer. He hesitated for just a moment, glancing at the hills he'd come to know as home, before trusting Ellie's steady voice to lead him forward. The ramp thudded closed behind him. They double-checked the locks, then stood in the pale sunlight for a moment, neither wanting to be the one to say goodbye to the farm. Ellie slid behind the wheel, Sophie beside her. She looked back once, seeing Thunder's ears twitch through the bars of the trailer window, then started the engine. The Land Rover roared reluctantly to life, rattling as if protesting the journey. But it moved. They wound through the narrow Yorkshire lanes, past dry stone walls and grazing sheep. The land changed as they traveled. Valleys gave way to low hills, then to rolling fields patched with wildflowers and ancient oaks. Ellie felt the miles and years sliding by, the road stretching out both behind and ahead of her. They stopped only once before noon, pulling into a little roadside lay-by to check on Thunder. He stood calmly in the trailer, munching hay and nuzzling Sophie's hand as she whispered encouragement. A few cars slowed as they passed, some drivers giving them a wave, others a bemused look at the battered farm truck and its precious cargo. Back on the road, Sophie scrolled through photos of past Badminton Horse Trials on her phone, her nerves growing as the reality set in. These were the best riders in the country, horses worth more than the whole Thompson farm. She glanced at Ellie, searching for reassurance. "You really think we belong there?" she asked quietly. Ellie kept her eyes on the road, but her voice was gentle. "Everyone belongs somewhere, Sophie. It just takes some people longer to find their place. We're not here for them. We're here for Thunder, and for ourselves. They reached the halfway mark just before the village of Malmesbury. That was when the first sign of trouble appeared. The defender gave a shudder as Ellie pulled onto the main road. Then a sickly grinding noise rose from beneath the hood. She frowned, slowing the vehicle. Sophie bit her lip, eyes wide. "Please don't let it be the engine," Ellie muttered. They pulled into a muddy pull-off beside a field dotted with wild poppies. Ellie popped the hood, a plume of steam billowing out. Sophie stood back, arms crossed, watching helplessly. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Ellie bent over the engine, hands steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. She checked the oil, the radiator, the belts, but it was clear the Defender wasn't going anywhere fast. A sleek silver Volvo slowed to a stop beside them. Out stepped a man in his mid-40s, tall, dark-haired, with a calm, open face and the weathered hands of someone used to hard work. He took in the scene, the steaming Land Rover, the nervous girl, the anxious horse in the trailer, and smiled. "Need a hand?" he asked. Ellie hesitated, pride flaring, but the look on Sophie's face, uncertain, a little scared, made the decision for her. "If you know engines, you're welcome to take a look," she said. The man rolled up his sleeves and got to work, chatting as he examined the Defender. His name was Dr. Will Davies, a local vet who'd spent years traveling the countryside to care for horses and farm animals. As he worked, he asked about Thunder, about the competition, about their story. Sophie warmed to him immediately, telling him all about Thunder's rescue, the training, the challenge from the Harringtons. Will listened, genuinely interested, and nodded as she spoke. "You've got spirit, both of you," he said, tightening a bolt. "And that horse? He's something special. I've seen my share of rescues, but he's got the look of a fighter. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Ellie watched Will as he worked. He had a gentle way about him, moving quietly so as not to spook Thunder, never rushing or boasting. When he finally closed the hood, the Defender coughed back to life. Weak, but running. "It'll get you as far as Badminton, but you'll want a proper mechanic to look at it before you go home," Will advised. Ellie smiled for the first time that day. "Thank you for everything." He shrugged, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Glad to help. Besides, I'll be at the trials myself. Maybe I'll see you there." Before they left, Will gave Thunder a quick check-over, running practiced hands along his legs and back. Thunder, usually wary of strangers, stood quietly, almost as if he understood the vet's intent. "He's in better shape than he looks," Will declared. "Just keep him warm tonight and make sure he gets plenty of water. You're doing all the right things." Ellie felt a wave of relief. She pressed a scrap of paper with her number into Will's hand, just in case, and then she and Sophie climbed back into the Defender. The last miles passed in tense silence, both of them listening for any sign of mechanical disaster. When the badminton grounds finally came into view, a sprawl of green fields, temporary stables, and white tents, Sophie let out a squeak of excitement and relief. They joined the queue of trucks and trailers, following signs toward the competitor's entrance. A volunteer checked their paperwork and directed them to a small, far corner of the grounds, a patch of uneven grass with a view of the grandstands in the distance. Their stable was little more than a converted cattle shed, the roof patched with tarps. But Ellie smiled as she led Thunder inside. "It's not much," she said, "but it's ours." They unloaded their gear and set up Thunder's stall with extra hay and fresh water. The other competitors' horses were sleek, muscled, shining like living bronze. But Thunder stood tall, unafraid, as if he understood this was his moment. As dusk fell, Sophie sat with Thunder, stroking his neck. "We made it," she whispered. "We really made it." Ellie joined her, wrapping an arm around Sophie's shoulders as they watched the shadows lengthen across the field. Somewhere nearby, music drifted from the main tent, and the sounds of laughter and celebration echoed through the night. For a moment, all the hardship, the doubts, the whispered laughter of neighbors and rivals faded into the background. Here, under the endless English sky, Ellie, Sophie, and Thunder were exactly where they belonged. And tomorrow, they would show the world just what they could do. Badminton was alive from the first light, bustling with energy that buzzed through the tents and stables like electricity. Flags from across the country snapped in the breeze, and everywhere Ellie looked, she saw riders and horses, some stretching, some grooming, some already trotting in neat circles across dew-laced grass. The great white grandstands rose above the showground, and the air held that peculiar mix of nerves and hope that comes before a storm. Ellie, Sophie, and Thunder stepped cautiously into this new world. Their assigned stable was tucked far from the others, past a row of glossy horse boxes and perfectly manicured fields. The barn itself was nothing more than an old timber shed, patched up with blue tarpaulin, far from the main entrance, and the warm glow of camaraderie that seemed to buzz among the big stables. Still, Ellie told herself, at least it would keep Thunder dry if the rain came. They worked together to make Thunder as comfortable as possible, laying fresh straw and hanging a borrowed rug to block the draft. Ellie filled his bucket with water, while Sophie set out his favorite feed, oats and apples, just as they'd always done at home. "He looks happy," Sophie said, watching Thunder nose through the straw. Ellie nodded, but her eyes were sharp as she glanced around. The other competitors passed by without a word, some giving Thunder a once-over, others whispering behind gloved hands. Charlie and James Harrington strutted nearby, their matching jackets emblazoned with the estate crest, their horses tended by a small army of grooms. They didn't even bother to hide their smirks as they saw Ellie's humble setup. "Ignore them," Ellie muttered, focusing on Thunder's soft wicker. "They don't know what's inside him. Or us." As the day stretched on, they registered with event officials and walked the cross-country course together. The obstacles were bigger and more complex than anything Thunder had seen. Brush jumps, water hazards, towering oxers, tight bends between white rails. Sophie took notes in her little sketchbook, mapping out strategies, her nerves hidden behind determination. Back at their shed, a shadow flickered at the entrance. Dr. Will Davies appeared, his smile a calming anchor in the swirl of excitement and anxiety. He checked Thunder over, offering a few words of encouragement. "He's ready," he said. "I've seen horses win here with half his heart." Ellie smiled, but just then a volunteer hurried up with a clipboard. "Sorry, but there's been a last-minute change. Your stall's needed for another entry. We've moved you and your horse to the old dairy at the back." Ellie's eyebrows shot up. "The dairy? That's even farther out." "Regulations, ma'am." "Nothing we can do," the volunteer said apologetically, before scurrying away. They packed up Thunder's gear again and led him along a muddy lane behind the event grounds, past delivery vans and dumpsters. The old dairy was drafty, the walls damp, and the only light came from a bare bulb dangling on a frayed cord. Ellie set her jaw, fighting the urge to march back and demand an explanation. "We'll make it work," she said, "mostly for Sophie's sake. They set up Thunder's new stall as best they could. Sophie sat with him while Ellie checked the competition schedule. Just as she was about to head back, she noticed something odd. A man in an official's vest, someone she didn't recognize, ducking quickly out of sight behind the feed bins. That night, Ellie stayed later than usual in the stall, uneasy. As Sophie drifted off to sleep in the makeshift cot they'd set up, Ellie double-checked Thunder's water and feed. Everything looked normal, but she couldn't shake the nagging sense of being watched. The first round of the trials was early the next morning. Thunder needed rest and fuel. Ellie double-checked his food again, then finally let herself sleep for a few hours, her mind still buzzing. She woke to Sophie's urgent whisper, "Ellie, Thunder's acting funny." Ellie rushed to the stall. Thunder's head hung low, and his eyes were dull. He refused his feed, shying away from the bucket, and his sides trembled. "No," Ellie breathed. "Not now." Will arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion. He ran his hands along Thunder's body, checking his gums, his breathing, his pulse, his brow furrowed. "It looks like he's had something that upset his system. Could be nerves, or something else. What's he been fed?" Ellie's stomach dropped. "I gave him his usual oats and apple, but last night I noticed someone hanging around." Will knelt, sifting through the feed. His nose wrinkled. "There's a sweet chemical smell to this. Smell that, Sophie?" Sophie leaned in, her eyes widening. "That's not from home." Ellie's hands tightened into fists. Someone had tampered with Thunder's feed. Her mind raced to the Harringtons, their sneers and quiet laughs. The rules were clear. Any trace of doping would mean immediate disqualification, even a ban. Will turned to her, voice calm but urgent. "We need to flush his system fast. Water, lots of it. Keep him walking. I'll get something from my van to settle his stomach. Don't let anyone near him who you don't trust." They worked together, moving Thunder gently around the tiny enclosure, coaxing him to drink. Will returned with an electrolyte solution, and after what felt like hours, Thunder's eyes grew clearer, his trembling eased. He snorted, head lifting, a bit of his usual spark returning. Ellie hugged Sophie tightly. "You saved him," she whispered. Sophie shook her head. "We all did, but the clock was ticking. With only an hour to the first round, Thunder would have to rally fast." Ellie stormed to the event officials. She explained what had happened, her words measured but fierce. The official in charge listened, took notes, and promised an investigation. But Ellie could see doubt in his eyes. "It's hard to prove, ma'am, unless you saw someone actually tamper with the feed." Frustrated but undeterred, Ellie returned to Thunder's side. Sophie had braided his mane with trembling hands, her face set with resolve. "No one is taking this from us," Ellie said, her voice steely. "Not after everything." Thunder was still weaker than usual, but when Sophie opened the stall door, he walked out into the daylight with his head high, his eyes locked on Ellie's. As they led him toward the showground, the other competitors stared, some in sympathy, others with suspicion. The Harrington brothers watched from the sidelines, sharing a quiet word as Ellie passed. Charlie smirked, tipping his cap. Will fell into step beside Ellie, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You got this," he murmured. "Just ride your ride. You and Thunder know each other better than anyone here. Don't let them shake you." Ellie nodded, steeling herself for the day ahead. Thunder snorted, shaking his mane, the worst of the danger seemingly past. Sophie smiled for the first time since sunrise, slipping her arm around Ellie's waist as the loudspeaker crackled with their names. As they walked into the arena, under the watchful gaze of the crowd and the judgment of their rivals, Ellie knew something in her heart had changed. This wasn't just about proving the Harringtons wrong or winning a ribbon. It was about resilience, about refusing to back down in the face of underhanded odds, about fighting for each other, even when the world seemed set against them. The test would be fierce. But for the first time, Ellie truly believed they were ready. The crowd at Badminton Horse Trials pressed close to the rails, faces turned toward the sprawling arena where the biggest names in English equestrian sport had gathered. Announcers' voices crackled over the speakers, listing titles and pedigrees, but Ellie barely heard them as she waited in the holding area. Thunder's breath warm against her shoulder. Every sense felt sharpened. Every nerve tingled. The memory of the poisoned feed, the long journey, and the quiet contempt of the Harrington brothers seemed to fade as she locked eyes with her horse. Sophie stood at Thunder's head, one hand tangled in his freshly braided mane. She looked older in that moment, wiser, steadier. Thunder, once a trembling shadow at the edge of the woods, now stood calm and ready, muscles bunched and gleaming beneath his coat. His eyes never left Ellie's face, searching for reassurance and drawing strength from the touch of her hand. The loudspeaker announced their number. Ellie took a steadying breath, swung herself into the old saddle, and nodded to Sophie. Sophie's eyes shone with pride and hope as she opened the gate, leading them onto the main field. The noise of the crowd faded into a hush as Ellie and Thunder moved into the center of the arena. She could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes, some curious, some skeptical, some silently rooting for them to fail. The Harrington brothers lounged near the rail, Charlie wearing a smirk, James idly checking his watch. But Ellie only saw Thunder. She dropped the reins, trusting the horse beneath her more than she'd ever trusted anyone, letting her body speak the language of partnership they'd spent weeks forging. The first test was dressage, a dance of subtle signals, patience, and poise. Ellie guided Thunder with the lightest touch of her heel, a shift of her weight, a whisper of her hand. He responded like a dream, executing each movement with unexpected grace. The judges, expecting clumsiness from a wild rescue, leaned forward, their pens pausing mid-air. Thunder's collected canter brought murmurs from the crowd. His halt and salute drew the first spontaneous applause of the day. Ellie heard Sophie whoop from the sidelines, the sound carrying over the fence. Next came the cross-country round, the true test of courage and connection. The course was brutal. Daunting log jumps, muddy ditches, banks, water hazards. Ellie's heart hammered as she guided Thunder toward the first fence. She whispered encouragement, feeling every muscle tense, then release as they soared together over the obstacle. The crowd gasped. They galloped on, navigating sharp turns, leaping over brush and water, mud flying in great arcs behind them. At the halfway point, a sudden squall blew in, wind howling, rain lashing across the field. Thunder stumbled at the water jump, hooves skidding, but Ellie steadied him, her words calm. "You're okay, boy. You're okay. Just us now." He snorted and surged forward, launching himself over the next barrier. Something passed between them in that instant, a surge of trust and raw belief. They were no longer a broken woman and a rescue horse. They were a team. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by the drama. Ellie could hear snatches of the crowd's commentary. "That's the rescue, isn't it? Look at them go. She's not using the reins. She's riding with her legs and voice." They neared the most difficult obstacle, a double oxer that had already unseated 2 experienced riders that morning. Thunder hesitated, and for a heartbeat Ellie saw the doubt flicker in his eyes. She leaned close, voice barely more than a breath. "Trust me." She released the reins, letting them fall against Thunder's neck. She rode with her body and her belief, giving him freedom and trust. The arena grew silent. Thunder gathered himself and leaped, soaring clean over the fence. The audience erupted, applause and cheers echoing off the grandstands. The announcer's voice broke with excitement. An extraordinary ride. A rescue horse. No reins. Unbelievable connection. Ellie felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, focusing on the course. They cleared the final fences, hearts pounding, spirits soaring, and raced toward the finish. Thunder's nostrils flared, mane flying, every line of his body alive with pride. They crossed the finish just inside the time limit, breathless and wild-eyed, to a standing ovation. Sophie ran to meet them, flinging her arms around Thunder's neck, tears streaming down her face. "You did it! You did it!" Ellie slid from the saddle, her knees buckling with relief and joy. For a long moment, she just leaned against Thunder, feeling his heart hammer against her cheek. Officials hurried over, checking tack and boots, but found nothing amiss. The judges exchanged glances, then spoke quietly among themselves. The Harrington brothers stood stiffly at the rail, their smugness replaced by something sharper, envy and disbelief. The awards ceremony was a blur. Thunder's name was called for the highest marks in the dressage round. Their cross-country time was nearly flawless. As they stood on the podium, a rosette in Thunder's bridle and a ribbon around Ellie's wrist, the crowd's cheers washed over them. Photographers snapped pictures, flashes bursting, reporters scribbling notes. Ellie Thompson and Thunder, the storybook team, the announcer intoned. Proof that heart, not just breeding or money, makes a champion. After the ceremony, people crowded around to shake Ellie's hand, to pet Thunder, to ask for Sophie's autograph. The old dairy stall was suddenly the most popular place on the grounds. Riders who'd barely glanced their way now offered congratulations, some sheepishly, others with genuine respect. Dr. Will Davies found them in the swirl of celebration, his smile wide and proud. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice thick. "I've never seen anything like it." Ellie hugged him, laughter spilling from her lips for the first time in ages. "It wasn't me," she said. "It was all of us." Even the officials who doubted them now crowded close, offering apologies for the earlier treatment, promising to look into the stall reassignment and the suspicious incident with the feed. As dusk settled over Badminton, Thunder stood calmly in the fading sunlight, a living symbol of resilience and hope. The impossible had happened, not just the victory, but the transformation of a lost horse, a grieving woman, and a lonely girl into something much greater than the sum of their wounds. And for Ellie, in the golden haze of triumph, every hardship faded away. For the first time in years, she truly felt seen, not for her scars, but for her courage. Tomorrow, more questions and challenges would surely come. But tonight, under the cheers of a crowd that had learned to believe, Ellie, Sophie, and Thunder were nothing less than champions. The celebration at Badminton Horse Trials spilled late into the evening, laughter and music drifting through the air as campfires burned and horses rested in their stalls. For Ellie, the euphoria of victory felt almost unreal. Every few minutes, someone else approached to offer congratulations, ask questions, or simply to pat Thunder's neck and marvel at the story of the rescue horse who had outshone pedigreed champions. Sophie, usually shy in crowds, wore a permanent grin as she told and retold their story to new fans. But beneath the joy, a current of unease hummed. The Harrington brothers had vanished after the awards, their tight faces leaving no doubt about their feelings. Ellie noticed them once near the competitor's tent, Charlie gesturing angrily as James tried to calm him down, but soon they melted into the shadows. Ellie tried to push it from her mind. For now, she wanted to savor the moment. Later that evening, as the crowds thinned and most had gone to their lorries or tents, a distinguished older gentleman approached. He wore a tweed jacket and a battered old hat, but there was nothing faded about his bearing. He moved like a man used to command. With him was a short, wiry man with sharp eyes and a weathered face. "Excuse me, are you Ellie Thompson?" the gentleman asked, his voice warm but measured. Ellie nodded, hand still on Thunder's neck. "I'm Sir Thomas Grantham," he said, extending a hand. "This is Jeremy Cole, a friend and former neighbor of mine. May we have a word? It concerns your horse." Ellie tensed but nodded. Sir Thomas leaned in, lowering his voice. "I couldn't help but notice Thunder's markings, particularly that scar above his left fetlock and the star on his forehead. I believe, if you'll indulge me, that he may not just be any rescue. Jeremy here has been searching for a horse fitting that exact description for the last 2 years." Ellie's breath caught. "You think Thunder was stolen?" Jeremy stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Thunder. "My Exmoor colt, Nightfall, disappeared from my land during a storm 2 winters ago. I searched every field in Gloucestershire, filed police reports, offered rewards, nothing. Nightfall was the last of a rare line, descended from a breed once reserved for royalty. Only a handful of people knew his value. He had a crescent-shaped scar from a foalhood injury. May I?" He waited for Ellie's nod before running his hands gently down Thunder's left foreleg. There, beneath the thick spring coat, was the unmistakable crescent-shaped scar. Thunder did not shy away. He seemed to recognize something in Jeremy's touch. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth. "You mean Thunder's really—" "A prize in more ways than one," Sir Thomas said softly. "But that also means whoever abandoned him knew exactly what they were doing. He was never just a lost pony." Ellie felt anger flare. Anger for Thunder, for the pain he'd suffered, and for the injustice of it all. "Who would do such a thing?" she demanded, voice tight. Jeremy looked at Sir Thomas, then nodded. "We have reason to believe the Harringtons, especially Charlie, had something to do with Nightfall's disappearance. There were rumors, but no proof. Now, seeing him here, alive, confirms everything." As if on cue, Charlie Harrington emerged from the shadows at the edge of the stable row, his face flushed and jaw set. "That's a serious accusation," he snapped. Sir Thomas turned on him, his presence filling the narrow space. "You'll have your chance to speak, Charlie. But first, you should know that there are witnesses and photographs of you and your men on Jeremy's land the night the colt vanished. You've made a habit of collecting rare animals, but this time, your arrogance caught up with you." A crowd began to gather, drawn by raised voices. Officials, riders, and a handful of reporters stood nearby, watching with bated breath. Dr. Will Davies arrived and stood at Ellie's side, his face grim. Ellie stepped forward, refusing to let Charlie dominate the moment. Thunder, Nightfall, suffered because of someone's greed. Whoever left him to die in those woods should answer for it. Charlie scoffed. "You can't prove a thing. That's just a horse. Any marks could be coincidence." But Jeremy had already pulled out a sheaf of papers, a report from the vet, microchip records, photographs of Nightfall as a foal. The evidence was overwhelming. A hush fell over the crowd as officials examined the documents, comparing the markings and scars on Thunder to the records. An official looked up at Charlie, his voice cold. "We'll be contacting the authorities, Mr. Harrington. I suggest you stay on the grounds until you've answered their questions." The color drained from Charlie's face, but his arrogance faltered only slightly. "You all want to believe in fairy tales?" he sneered. "But life isn't like that." Ellie stood tall, meeting his gaze without blinking. "No, but sometimes justice is." As the officials led Charlie away, whispers rippled through the crowd. James Harrington hung back, clearly shaken, and offered Ellie a mumbled apology before disappearing into the darkness. The entire atmosphere shifted. What had begun as a rivalry now felt like the closing of an old wound. Jeremy turned to Ellie, emotion tightening his voice. "I owe you more than I can say. You saved Nightfall. You gave him a chance when everyone else turned away." Ellie shook her head, tears in her eyes. "He saved us. We needed each other." Sir Thomas clapped Ellie gently on the shoulder. "You've reminded everyone here what this sport is meant to be about. Heart, integrity, and second chances." Will squeezed Ellie's hand. Sophie hugged Thunder, her cheeks streaked with tears and dirt and pride. "What happens now?" Sophie asked quietly. Jeremy smiled. "I think Nightfall's already chosen his family. If it's all right with you, I'd like to stay involved. But I wouldn't dream of taking him from you." Ellie looked at Thunder, who nuzzled her pockets for a treat. She knew, deep down, he was already home. "He belongs with us," she said softly, "but you'll always be welcome." The crowd drifted away, but news of the confrontation traveled fast. The next day, stories ran in the local and national press. Rescue horse crowned champion and exposes scandal at Badminton. The Harrington estate's reputation plummeted, sponsors pulled out, and Charlie faced official investigation. But at Thompson Farm and in every heart that had watched the underdogs win, the story of Thunder, Nightfall, had already become legend. Ellie and Sophie stood together in the quiet after the storm, their hands resting on Thunder's neck, the sky just beginning to brighten. They had weathered every challenge, faced down the worst of jealousy and cruelty, and found the truth in the unlikeliest of places. For Ellie, it wasn't just about winning a trophy or exposing a scandal. It was about restoring what had been broken in her life and Thunder's, and giving hope to anyone who'd ever been left behind. The sun rose, golden and strong, and the world felt new again. The days after Badminton felt brighter than any spring Ellie could remember. Thunder, now known to all as Nightfall, became something of a local celebrity, his story spreading through the countryside like wildfire. Newspapers called for interviews, and the phone at Thompson Farm rang off the hook with well-wishers, journalists, and old friends reaching out to reconnect. But beneath the applause, real change was happening. The badminton organizers launched a formal investigation into the events surrounding Thunder's poisoning and his long-ago disappearance. The evidence, witness accounts, Jeremy's documentation, and the microchip verification was overwhelming. In less than a week, the Harringtons' empire began to unravel. Charlie Harrington, once so proud and untouchable, was now facing legal consequences. He was summoned for questioning about Thunder's theft and the attempted sabotage at the trials. The community, once dazzled by the Harrington wealth, watched with a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction as authorities searched their estate, uncovering records that linked Charlie to other questionable dealings over the years. missing livestock, falsified breeding records, and intimidation of competitors. The Harrington estate, stripped of its luster, became a cautionary tale. Sponsors withdrew support. Their prized horses were seized for investigation, and James Harrington, shamed and regretful, left the business altogether. For many in the village, the fall of the Harringtons felt like justice long overdue. But for Ellie, the greatest victory wasn't in the public spectacle. It was in the quiet moments. Sophie's laughter returning to the farmhouse, the smell of fresh bread in the kitchen, and the sound of Thunder's hooves drumming the soft earth behind the barn. Jeremy Cole spent long afternoons at the farm, working side by side with Ellie and Sophie. He brought photos and records of Thunder's lineage, tracing his bloodline back generations. With each story and memory, a new layer of connection grew between them, a partnership built not on ownership, but on trust, gratitude, and a shared sense of purpose. One evening, after supper, Jeremy stood at the edge of the paddock as Thunder grazed, the setting sun painting his coat gold. "I can't thank you enough," Jeremy said, voice thick with emotion. "I spent months searching for him, and I never would have dreamed he'd turn up here, with people who loved him so fiercely." Ellie shook her head, smiling gently. "He found us when we needed him most," she said. "Maybe that's the way it's meant to be." Sophie came running up, hair flying, her face glowing with excitement. "We got another letter," she called out, waving a thick envelope. Ellie took it and read aloud. It was from the Ministry of Defense responding to her application for a grant. She'd written to them, explaining her idea to turn the farm into a place where veterans could heal, working with rescued horses, finding peace and purpose together. After seeing Thunder's story in the press, the ministry wanted to help. "They're sending an inspector next month," Ellie said, her voice trembling with hope. "If it goes well, we could start the Thompson Cole Horsemanship Center by summer." Sophie's grin was infectious. "Imagine it, Grandma. Horses everywhere, and people who need a home, just like us." Jeremy laughed, his eyes bright. "I'll help however I can. Nightfall Thunder will be the best ambassador you could ask for." Work began at once. The village rallied behind the idea, pitching in with donations, tools, and volunteer hours. Old friends from Ellie's army days sent messages of support, some even planning trips to help with renovations. Will Davies, ever the steady anchor, became the project's unofficial vet, overseeing the health of the horses that would soon fill the stables. Every day brought new challenges. Fences needed mending, fields clearing, the old barn converting into a classroom and therapy center. Ellie and Sophie worked until their hands blistered and their backs ached, but the energy that filled the farm was infectious. Neighbors stopped by to lend a hand, often leaving with a sense of pride and belonging. One afternoon, a battered pickup pulled into the yard. A man climbed out, middle-aged, lean, with haunted eyes, and the hesitant gait of someone who hadn't asked for help in a long time. "Is this the place for veterans?" he asked, voice rough. Ellie smiled, welcoming him. "You're in the right place. Come meet Thunder." Sophie led him to the paddock, introducing Thunder as if presenting royalty. The man's face softened as he stroked the horse's nose, a spark of something gentle flickering in his eyes. "He understands," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. That was the first of many. Word spread, and soon other veterans arrived, men and women carrying burdens invisible to most. Some brought families, some came alone. They found solace in the rhythm of the farm, in the quiet power of the horses, and in the warmth of a community that refused to let anyone be left behind. Thunder, Nightfall, became a legend in his own time. Not just for his victory at badminton, but for his role in mending hearts and restoring hope. Kids from the village would bike out just to feed him apples and brush his mane. Reporters still visited, but the real stories now were of laughter, healing, and transformation. The Harrington estate, meanwhile, stood empty and overgrown. The land was sold off in parcels, some of it bought by the newly formed Thompson Cole Horsemanship Center, expanding their pastures and creating space for even more horses in need. What had once been a symbol of greed and arrogance now became a field of second chances. One crisp evening, Ellie, Sophie, Jeremy, and Will sat around a bonfire near the barn, the sky alive with stars. Thunder grazed quietly nearby, his breath steaming in the cool air. "To family," Sophie said, raising her mug of tea. "To second chances," Jeremy added, smiling at Ellie. Ellie felt the weight of years, pain and joy, loss and hope, settle into something peaceful. She looked at the faces illuminated by firelight and knew, at last, that she was home. "To Thunder," she said quietly, "for saving us all." The others echoed her, and laughter rose into the night. The next morning brought new visitors, new tasks, and new dreams. The old farmhouse buzzed with life. Children's voices, the ring of hammers, the scent of fresh bread and wildflowers. The land, once so silent and lonely, had become a beacon for all who needed a place to belong. Ellie stood by the paddock, hand on Thunder's neck, and watched the sunrise spill gold across the hills. She thought of her journey, the losses, the battles, the nights she'd almost given up, and felt only gratitude. Every pain had been a seed for something better. Justice had been served, not by punishment alone, but by the creation of something lasting and good. And as the light spread across Thompson Farm, Ellie knew the real prize wasn't a trophy or headline. It was this: the certainty that, together, they could turn heartbreak into hope, for themselves and for all who would come after. The Yorkshire hills rolled green and wide under the warm gold of late summer. On Thompson Farm, the days now began with the low murmur of voices, the thud of boots on earth, and the gentle nickering of horses greeting the dawn. What had once been a lonely, weather-beaten place had become a living center of hope, a place where broken things could be mended and lost souls could find their way home. Thunder, still called Nightfall by Jeremy and the few who remembered his long-lost pedigree, had grown into the role of ambassador with the dignity of an old king. Children clustered around his stall, brushing his coat until it gleamed, and veterans learned to steady trembling hands with the rhythm of his breath. Thunder never seemed to tire of their company. His eyes, once wary and wild, now glowed with an easy trust, as if he had finally accepted his own story, scars and all. Ellie often stood at the edge of the paddock, watching the life unfolding around her. Sometimes it hardly felt real. The classrooms in the old barn filled with laughter, the fields dotted with horses in every color and shape, Sophie's voice echoing as she led another riding lesson. Jeremy was never far, his laughter as much a part of the landscape now as the song of larks or the distant bells from the village. Will stopped by almost daily, always with a new animal to check or a story to share. Ellie herself had become something of a legend. Her years as an army medic, the story of the miracle horse, the farm's transformation. Sometimes reporters still called, but more often it was letters from strangers, veterans who wanted a fresh start, kids who'd heard about Thunder and dreamed of meeting him, parents searching for a safe place for their children to learn about courage and kindness. But for Ellie, the most precious moments came when the farm was quiet, At dusk, when the sun hung low and golden above the fields, or late at night, when a breeze rattled the window panes and she could hear the gentle snuffling of horses in the barn. In those moments, she felt the presence of all she'd lost and all she'd gained. She remembered her father's hands guiding hers on a bridle, the ache of missing her daughter, the terror and purpose of the battlefield, and the long years of loneliness that had followed. Now, with Sophie's laughter and Thunder's steady heartbeat filling her days, the emptiness had finally ebbed. One afternoon, as summer edged toward fall, the Thompson Cole Horsemanship Center held its first community open day. Flyers went up in the village and neighboring towns. Come meet Thunder, learn about rescue, hope, and new beginnings. Hundreds came. Families, veterans, old neighbors, even a few who'd once doubted the dream. There were games for children, demonstrations in the ring, and tables groaning with homemade food. Thunder performed his now famous no reins routine with Ellie in the saddle, moving in perfect harmony. The crowd roared. Afterward, Sophie gave tours, her cheeks flushed with pride as she showed visitors the barn, the paddocks, and the new classroom painted with murals of horses and wild moors. At sunset, Ellie gathered everyone at the main paddock. She cleared her throat, nerves fluttering, but when she saw the faces, so many faces, waiting for her words, a quiet calm settled in. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice carrying over the hush. "I never imagined this place would become what it is today. Thompson Farm used to be just a quiet corner of the world, a place to disappear. But Thunder changed that. He reminded us that even when we feel lost or broken, there's a way back to light. All it takes is a little faith, a little stubbornness, and the help of good friends." She paused, searching the crowd for Sophie, Jeremy, and Will, and found them smiling back. This farm, this center, isn't just about horses or riding. It's about giving people a place to belong, about proving that no one is beyond help and no one has to walk alone. Every scar tells a story, and every story matters. The crowd erupted in applause, but Ellie felt tears prick her eyes, not for sadness, but for the overwhelming weight of gratitude. Later, as twilight spilled across the hills, Ellie walked out to the far paddock where Thunder grazed quietly, his silhouette framed against the blazing sky. Sophie trailed after her, a blanket draped over her shoulders. "You all right?" Sophie asked, her voice soft. Ellie nodded, reaching out to stroke Thunder's neck. I never thought I'd see this day. There were times I thought about giving up, but then you came, and Thunder came, and somehow everything changed." Sophie leaned into her side. "You never gave up, Grandma. You taught me not to either." They stood together, watching the last light linger on Thunder's coat. "Do you think it'll last?" Sophie asked quietly. "All this, will it stay?" Ellie smiled, looking down at her granddaughter. "I think it will. Not because life gets easier, but because we keep choosing each other. As long as we keep showing up, keep opening the doors for whoever needs a place, we'll be all right." Thunder lifted his head, ears flicking toward the sounds of children still playing near the barn. He nickered softly, and Ellie pressed her face to his warm neck. "You're a miracle," she whispered. "Thank you." Sophie grinned. "He's not the only miracle here." The farm quieted as night descended. One by one, the guests departed, their laughter trailing down the lane. Will lingered, helping Jeremy secure the gates and tidy the yard, while Ellie and Sophie settled Thunder for the night. They moved through the familiar routine, brushing his coat, checking his water, whispering their thanks and hopes into the darkness. As the stars blinked to life overhead, Ellie stood at the porch and looked out over the land. She thought of all the years she'd spent searching for a reason to keep going, the loneliness that had threatened to swallow her, and the stubborn, beautiful horse who had given her a second chance. She knew there would be challenges ahead, hard seasons, heartbreak, loss. But there would also be joy, friendship, and the steady, unbreakable bond she'd built with Thunder and Sophie. This was her legacy, not the trophies or headlines, but the lives touched, the hope restored, the circle of belonging that would ripple outward for years to come. At last, Ellie slipped inside, the house alive with gentle voices and warmth. She paused at the window, taking in one final look at the moonlit fields, and smiled. "We made it," she whispered. "We're home." And so, in the heart of Yorkshire, under the watchful gaze of the hills and stars, the story of Ellie, Sophie, and Thunder carried on, an unbroken journey of courage, compassion, and the quiet miracle of never giving up.